Today is the big day, so while you all wait to see where your favorite college star is going to land in the NBA draft, let's go through Locked On NBA Big Board contributor Leif Tulin's board with some final notes.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, and today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Bird Dogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnCollege, and when you enter the promo code LockedOnCollege, they will throw in a free custom Yeti-style bird tumbler with every order. All right, folks, it is Thursday, June 22nd. It is the day. The NBA draft is finally here after months of speculating, all sorts of conversation, who's going where, what's going to happen after, of course, Victor Wembanyama goes to the San Antonio Spurs. We are joined here today by Leif Tulin of the Locked On NBA Big Board, also a guest host of the Locked On Jazz podcast and a regular guest here on Locked On College Basketball. Leif has an updated big board, not a mock draft specifically, but a big board. And today we're going to go through the top 30 players on that board, discuss where they might go in the draft, what decisions he would make, why, so-and-so, all of that good stuff here, while you all anxiously await to find out whether your favorite NBA team is going to land your favorite college star, or, of course, where your favorite college star is going to go. Leif, we're just going to go ahead and get right into this. I'm going to read the top 10 on your board, and we're going to start discussing what we think about all of that. So, of course, no surprises here, no big drum roll necessary. Number one on the big board, Victor Wembanyama, going to the San Antonio Spurs in this case. There's no mystery there. That is going to happen. It starts to get a little interesting right after that here on the big board. Again, we'll just go through 2 through 10 here. Scoot Henderson at number 2, Brandon Miller from Alabama, the first college player here at number 3, Amen Thompson for the Houston Rockets in this case at number 4, Cam Whitmore from Villanova at 5, Jarace Walker from Houston at 6, Asar Thompson would be at the Indiana Pacers here at 7, Anthony Black at 8, from Arkansas, Taylor Hendricks at number 9, and then Cason Wallace, former Kentucky star, at number 10. Lot of one and dones here. I think that's kind of one of the first things that has stood out to me about this draft class in an era where we are seeing less one and done talent. If I'm not mistaken here, yes, every one of these players was a one and done who is coming out of the college ranks. Any surprise in that, Leif, that we're seeing more college one and dones this year than I think we have? I know last year we saw quite a few at the top of the draft as well, but is that surprising to you or kind of feel normal?
I'd say it's normal. I'd almost say last year was a little bit anomalous in the sense that, like, you had Jaden Ivey was a sophomore, Keegan Murray was a sophomore, Johnny Davis was a sophomore, Tari Eason, who went 17, was a sophomore, Mark Williams, who I think went 15, was a sophomore. So I think it's more rare that level of talent gets drafted that high if they return to school. Like, typically when you return to school, it means you didn't. Oh, and Matherin. I forgot Benedict Matherin.
Yeah.
So there's, I think that's more rare just because typically when you're like a highly touted recruit, you're billed like, hey, you go to our school, we're going to compete for a championship, and now you're gone. But those guys, that's 5 or 6 players that went in the top 20, and I may be missing others. That was just rattling off the top of my head.
Yeah.
That were legit, like top 10, top 20 picks, have produced at the NBA level already, that came back for sophomore years. So I think it is more common to see this where it's all one and dones in the top 10. And I, like, off the top of my head, I'd imagine only 2 sophomores get drafted in the first round this year, where, like, it's Kobe Bufkin and it's Jordan Hawkins.
Yeah.
And then you might get an upperclassman in Murray and Kobe Brown, but that seems more normal to me. It's strange conceptually, but that's more normal than what it's been in years past.
Well, we know the top 3 is going to be some combination of Wembanyama, Scoot, and Brandon Miller. I don't think there's really any mystery there. There's some mystery between 2 and 3 on what might happen there, but 4 through 7 is kind of a really interesting part of this draft. And of course, without knowing trades at this point as we're recording this, probably won't know trades until right during the actual draft at that point. But you have the 2 Thompson twins, and then you have Cam Whitmore and Jarace Walker. And it feels to me like that's going to be your top 7. You're going to have your top 3, and then you're going to have both the Thompson twins, Whitmore and Walker. That's what you have here. Does it feel like there's going to be a lot of movement in that top 7 outside of where those guys go? Or do you really feel like when the Pacers come up, or excuse me, when the Wizards come up at 8, that those 7 guys are going to be the guys off the board?
I think there's a little bit of movement tied to Cam Whitmore, who right now is starting to trend downward, according to rumors. That could be smoke, but sometimes where there's smoke, there's a fire.
Sure.
And so that would be the one guy I would look forward to slip. I think the top 7, I think, is fairly well entrenched. You could maybe see a team trade up, and maybe a team is more infatuated with a guy like Anthony Black, who I have 8, or Hendricks. The other possibility would be Indiana really likes Hendricks, and maybe the board falls where it's between Hendricks and Whitmore for them. And with Whitmore trending downward, maybe Indiana takes Hendricks. But I think for the majority of outcomes, that you're going to see 6 of the 7 players I have in my top 7 taken in the top 7.
So then you have Anthony Black at 8, Hendricks at 9, and Wallace at 10. And Black and Wallace are 2 players who have some similarities, defensive-minded guards, maybe didn't reach the overall offensive potential, in part because of system issues. At least that was a lot of it for Anthony Black at Arkansas. But we've seen these guys often mocked very close to each other. We've seen them kind of compared to each other in a lot of ways based on kind of what you've been reading and seeing, and just from your scouting eyes. What are the kind of key differences between those 2 guys? And most of the time we're seeing Black go before Wallace. Is there something in particular about him that just makes him a bit more appealing as a draft prospect at this point?
I think the biggest thing right now is just his sheer size. I think Anthony Black plays like he's 6'6" without shoes, like he is. And Cason Wallace measured in at about like 6'2" and a quarter without shoes. And so so much of the appeal of the NBA right now is positional size. And what Anthony Black does so well is he plays to that size. He's able to guard 1 through 3. He's able to be disruptive, getting past in lanes, rebound the ball, get to the rim, finish, that type of stuff. And Cason Wallace is really, really good at what he does. But I just think that he doesn't fit what NBA teams desire in terms of what they want from their guards right now. Because Anthony Black is not going to be your lead scorer. Cason Wallace probably won't either. So you might as well take the guy who fits defensively, and both are great defenders. Defensively can defend multiple positions. Offensively can see over defense, create, and has more natural passing chops. So I think that's the differentiator right now.
Taylor Hendricks, a guy we've talked about a few times here on the show, kind of a bit of a riser, as somebody who wasn't really on the radar even at all at the start of the season, has kind of steadily climbed into the draft conversation, and now all the way up into the top 10. If you had to guess, I know you have him 9th, obviously, on the big board here. If you had to guess, do you think he does go in the top 10, or do you think it's something where maybe he's still a lottery pick, but not quite in that top 10 conversation? Kind of where do you think the helium is at with him right now?
That's a really good question, because I know Indiana has a lot of ties to him. So if he goes to Indiana, then clearly top 10. But I don't think the Wizards or Jazz are necessarily as infatuated with him. I could be wrong.
Sure.
So then it goes to the Mavericks, to the last team in the 10. And to me, the Mavericks have maybe circled the horses. If they make this pick and don't trade, it's Derek Lively.
Yeah.
But now if Hendricks is available, there's a chance I could see them going for him, because he also fits spectacularly with Luka Doncic. So I will say I would guess it's Pacers or bust for a top 10, but I'd imagine he'd go 11th to the Magic if he's available.
Sure. Well, let's talk about 11, and let's talk about 11 through 20 here specifically, because there's a lot of talent left in this draft. It's a pretty deep class, and I want to talk about who you have ranked in those spots and what we kind of think about their NBA futures after a word from today's sponsor, Bird Dogs. I don't know how else to say this, so I'm just going to keep it simple, folks. Bird Dogs shorts and pants, they make you look good. The Bird Dogs stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, and they give you a truly sculpted look. In fact, Bird Dogs do the exact same thing as Lululemon, but they fit way better. They also fit way better than regular shorts made of stiff, restricting cotton. How? Well, Bird Dogs fixed it by inventing cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki but stretches so that you get a slimmer fit without sacrificing movement. It also uses anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that keeps you cool and dry all day long. So go to birddogs.com/lockedoncollege and enter the promo code LockedOnCollege for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That is birddogs.com/lockedoncollege for a free Yeti-style tumbler. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off. We promise you. Bird Dogs, a proud sponsor of the Locked On Podcast Network. Well, folks, the draft is here, and you do not want to miss the Locked On NBA Draft live on Thursday evening. It is pick-by-pick analysis from our stable of local NBA hosts, national reaction from our NBA Big Board hosts, including our friend Leif here, and live check-ins from inside the NBA Draft. Locked On NBA Draft live starting at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time on the Locked On NBA YouTube page. Well, Leif, let's continue our conversation looking at your most updated big board here on NBA Draft Day and some conversation around of some of our favorite college stars. Again, like we did in the first segment, we're just going to go through 11 through 20 here, the players that you have a lot more college guys here. In fact, almost all college players here in the middle part of the first round on the big board. Starting at 11, a player you mentioned there before we closed out the first segment, that's Derek Lively out of Duke. Kobe Bufkin comes up at number 12. Keyonte George from Baylor at 13. Jalen Hood Schifino, another freshman guard there from Indiana, comes in at 14. Leonard Miller is at 15. Bilal Coulibaly is at 16. G.G. Jackson at 17. Of course, out of South Carolina there. Noah Clowney from Alabama at 18, Nick Smith Jr. from Arkansas at 19, and then Gradey Dick at number 20 out of Kansas. And Leif, let's start there, because I think it's safe to say, based on a cursory look at your big board, that this is probably the area that you differ the most from NBA analysts. In fact, on our mock draft for Locked On NBA, Gradey Dick went 6th, which is higher than I would take him. I will say that with no disrespect to the people who did that mock draft, but 20 is also fairly low on Gradey Dick, lower than most of the consensus. We have talked about Gradey Dick in the past on this show, but for people who haven't heard any of that, I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on why Gradey Dick is somebody that you're not as high on. Granted, 20th is not horrible or anything, but why you're a little lower on him than everybody else.
Yeah, I think he and two other players fit an archetype that I think is like a luxury type of player and not one that's necessarily conducive to winning for most teams. And that's how I look at it. It's Jordan Hawkins and Jett Howard and Gradey Dick.
Yeah.
As for Gradey Dick, I think he is a very good shooter. I think Jordan Hawkins is the best shooter, but he's a little bit smaller, which is why he's further down. All three of them are defensively limited. And they're very good shooters, but they don't necessarily do much with the ball in their hands. Jett Howard's the best of the ball in his hands, but he's the worst of the defensively. But so to answer about Gradey Dick, I think his upside is close to, like, its ceiling would probably be close to Kevin Huerter, but I don't think he's ever going to have the ball handling that Kevin Huerter had. And quite frankly, I'm a nerd. And you know, I watched Kevin Huerter at Maryland, and I thought his tape was better than Kansas Gradey Dick's was. So that's and he went 17th in the draft. That was pretty good. So, and if you were to do a redraft, he might be like 13th. I went through this the other day. Anyway, Kevin Huerter was played off the court in the playoffs. And so now why is that important? It's because, yes, there are teams where Kevin Huerter or Gradey Dick could be very impactful. If you've got a LeBron James in his prime and you're saying, you know what, let's space the court and let's get great shots and find people who will knock them down, that's wonderful. But not every team has that. So more teams, I think, could benefit from players that are good on both ends of the floor rather than a specialist at one trait of basketball. And so that's why I've prefaced this as having him lower, just because I think more teams could use the skill sets of other players.
Moving towards the top of this group here, 11 through 14, the end of the lottery. That's where we have Lively and Bufkin and George and Hood Schifino. Curious, Leif, just out of those four players, who do you think is the least likely to actually get selected in the lottery? And of those four, who is the most likely? And I think I know the answer to this one because you kind of teased it already. Who is the most likely of these four to end up going in the top 10?
Well, I would say Lively is the most likely because I think the Dallas Mavericks have strong ties to him and due to necessity. And because they already have a star, they just need someone to defend and catch lobs. The one concern I have with making that like my bet, so to speak, would be if the Mavericks move back because they don't want to take him at 10 because fewer teams need a center.
Right.
So the other person I have pretty steadfast confidence in is Kobe Bufkin. I'm pretty sure based off what I'm hearing that he'll be a lottery pick, and I wouldn't be stunned. I would be shocked, but I wouldn't be stunned if he's a top 10 pick.
Okay.
As for the most likely to fall out of that group, I think there's 5 guards that I think will be picked between 10 and 17. It's Kobe Bufkin, it's Cason Wallace, it's Jalen Hood Schifino, it's Nick Smith, and Keyonte George.
Yeah.
And I think 3 of those probably go in the lottery and 2 fall out. So, you could pick your order. Of the ones that you asked about, I'd say Hood Schifino is most likely to fall out. I think Nick Smith is the other one that I think slips just because he had some injuries and there are fewer fits, so to speak. But there are teams that could afford an upside swing, and it'd be between he and Keyonte George.
Let's focus on Keyonte George a little bit as well, because he's a player who the momentum on him has kind of swung somewhat rapidly. He had that monster performance before the college basketball season with Baylor, which had his stock like extremely high. And he was good throughout the season for Baylor. I don't think there's any debate there, but the efficiency wasn't great. We've seen his stock kind of fluctuate. Sometimes he still shows up in the top 10. That's been a little bit less often recently. I know that the host of Locked On NBA Big Board there, Rafael Barlow's talked about how Keyonte George isn't going to fall past the Raptors at 13. At least I remember him saying that at one point. For George, what do you kind of think what is the best fit for him from like not a specific team necessarily, but like where does he need to go to really thrive and reach the potential? Because I think the potential is clearly there, but he also strikes me as a player that if he ends up in the wrong spot, he might be somebody who doesn't get talked about all that much a couple years from now.
This is the most interesting guy that's like fluctuated on my board. I'm pretty confident in most of my takes at the top, but George I've had as high as like 6 entering the year and as low as like 17 mid-year. I watched those games that you referenced, every minute of each of those games, and I was like, my Lord, this guy's unbelievable. And this is without Flagler, and this was without Cryer. Yeah. And he had Baylor, who honestly was not that good this year, overachieving, contending against these type of teams. They lost, but like, man, he was unbelievable. So I actually did a podcast for Locked On NBA Big Board during the summer when we're kind of scratching for content. And I compared him to Jamal Murray. I said, you know what? If you give him a guy who can be another facilitator, I'm not saying you need Nikola Jokic, but you just need someone else who's got the capacity to facilitate. This guy can score 20 a game and do some of point guard traits. Like he is a combo guard. He's not a true point guard, but I think that's what he wants to be. So the reason I say all of that is he could thrive in that situation. So which is why the Raptors is an interesting spot, because Scotty Barnes can handle some of that facilitation. So I actually agree with Raphael in that regard. As for concerns why he could slip, I think he wasn't very efficient in college. I watched him in person play at Denver in March Madness, and I was really disappointed in kind of like the poutiness. And so I moved him down. But he was the best shooter that I saw of any pro day. So like there are a lot of pros. There are some cons. I think situation's going to be big in terms of how good he can be. But I think there are more avenues to success than we necessarily anticipate of a guy that comes in as like he's a scorer, but he doesn't pass. But now he's playing point guard. I think that's a little harsh for him. And I think there are more avenues for him than maybe some of those archetypes of the past.
Yeah. I want to talk about the bigs here. 17, G.G. Jackson, 18, Noah Clowney, 2 guys you have right next to each other. And this goes without saying, but obviously team fit is going to be a big factor. Those 2 guys are pretty different in terms of their skill set and what they're bringing to the table and their readiness to play right now in the NBA. So it's not as simple as this guy's slightly better than this guy. It depends on fit, but I would love to hear kind of your thoughts on both these guys as potential top 20 guys. G.G. Jackson has been a guy who's kind of moved, again, sort of like George, he's moved all over the place. Some places are much, much higher on him than other places. Clowney's been a little bit more consistent in where he's at, but I'd kind of just love to hear your thoughts on those 2 guys and how this NBA draft process might shake out for them.
These are 2 of my guys, I guess. If and everyone's got like, players they like over the consensus. These are 2 for me. G.G. Jackson at one point in this draft cycle, I had at number 7 and entering the combine. And then I watched him work out for his pro day and he just did not look very good. So I think my eyes in person are having a hard time like forgetting what I saw. Yeah. But here's the pitch for him. Youngest player in the draft. Should be a year younger, should be entering his freshman year of college, committed to North Carolina, played at South Carolina, developed his repertoire on a terrible team, an absolutely horrible team that played against SEC competition, which was the oldest conference in America. And he just, was 18 against 23-year-olds. He still scored 15 a game, still showed flashes of just shot making you can't teach at 6'9". If he were in his own high school class, which is admittedly a little bit worse of a class, he's a top 5 pick. So why not take him earlier than maybe you might think and try to cultivate that top 5 pick a year ahead of time?
Yeah.
So I think, he's got more star potential than just about anyone outside the top 5. Like, just quite frankly, I think that's the case. As for Noah Clowney is not quite the star power, but I think there's just no way he fails. Like, I love the way that he plays. I think Alabama had too many bigs, and I think that's why Bediako, quite frankly, is in the NBA draft, because Noah Pringle is emerging. So what do? They played Clowney, who I think would be better suited as a center, as a power forward. He took 47% of his shot attempts from 3.
Wow.
So he didn't shoot great, but after a 2 of 16 start, he shot 38%. It's a fairly good sample size. So, not a great shooter, but he's confident shooting them. Now he goes and plays the 5, small ball 5, excellent hands, moves his feet, can protect the rim both vertically and by moving his feet, a la like Jalen Williams of Arkansas, now on the Thunder, who takes charges. He may not take as many charges, but he's someone who can defend that in both ways, switch on defense, rebound. And I think, he's not the biggest guy, but I think he's a top 5 rebounder in this class. Yeah. Like, he's a magnet for the ball. And then if he rolls instead of pops, I think his efficiency improves through the roof. And I think if you took him off the Alabama team, that team really suffered. Like, he was such an intangible piece to what they did as the best team in college basketball, in my opinion. So that's the pitch for him. I'm a Jazz fan. I'll make no hiding of that. If the Jazz take a guard at 9 and they don't want to go guard, which, I don't think that's actually a big deal.
Yeah.
Redundancy. I'd look at Noah Clowney, even though a lot of mocks him in the mid-20s. I would take a long look at Noah Clowney as someone that I think could contribute immediately and down the road.
Well, this is considered a pretty deep draft class. And just from my eyes right now, we have 15, 18 or so different players left that we haven't talked about that I think could conceivably go in the first round. So we're going to cover the rest of the big board here from Leif coming up right after this. All right, folks, segment 3 here. Still Andy Patton, still locked on college basketball. Still chatting with Leif Tulane about his big board here on NBA Draft Day. We've gone through players 1 through 20 on the big board. I'm going to read 21 through 30 here. We'll discuss these guys and maybe a few other players who aren't on the list who might sneak into the first round. Here at 21, Brice Sensabaugh from Ohio State. 22, Dariq Whitehead from Duke. 23, Sidy Cissoko. 24, Chris Murray, of course, brother of Keegan Murray there. 25, Maxwell Lewis from Pepperdine. 26, Jett Howard. 27, Jordan Hawkins. You mentioned those guys as the other big shooters, pure shooters in this class. 28, Ryan Rupert. 29, Kobe Brown, and 30 from Tennessee, Julian Phillips. Leif, a lot of good names here, a lot of talent at the end of this draft. I know, as somebody who is a Blazers fan, I have not hidden that either. Very interested what they're going to do with 3, but also very interested what they're going to do at 23 as well, because I think there's a lot of really talented players in that mix. Noah Clowney is actually a guy I really think the Blazers could conceivably take at 23 if he is still there. But want to talk about a few of the kind of guards here towards the top. You have Sensabaugh, you have Whitehead. We just had Gradey Dick and Nick Smith at 19 and 20, so kind of a collection of guards there. How do you feel in general about kind of the depth in the 20 range, particularly when you're looking at some of those guard players who might be available in that range?
I think it's interesting because a lot of these guards have qualities that could make them higher picks, but they have deficiencies that put them lower on my board for that reason. For instance, Sensabaugh is one of the best shooters. Like, he could be considered among those shooters. I just don't consider him like a one-dimensional shooter. Sure. But the reason he's that low is defensively, he was abysmal. Yeah. And secondly, his knee injuries scare me a little bit because he's kind of got like an unconventional body for the NBA. He's very much like a bully ball player. Yeah. So like that's one player. And now if you look at some other guards, like Sidy Cissoko is athletically phenomenal. I actually had him in my lottery entering the combine, and then I watched him work out, and his shot just looked miles away. Whereas percentages, even against good competition in the G League, somehow belied the fact that his shot is nowhere near ready to be impactful. So the way I'd put it is these are players that I think, should they develop their weaknesses, are guys that are lottery caliber players. They just have weaknesses that I think are more glaring immediately. But I mean, those two in particular, I really think have pretty high upside, especially that late in the draft. And I actually do think that's kind of the range where they're going to be selected, which is rare because sometimes like I'll put someone low and penalize them for something like a trait like that. And then they go higher and I have a good feeling that might happen, like Gradey Dick. He's not going to go 20th.
Right.
But that's just like what I perceive where he should go. But these guys, I think they will go there. And I think there's a very good chance they could get steals. Like if I'm picking in the mid 20s and I get one of those guys, I'd be pretty thrilled, honestly, because all they got to do is change a few things. And I think they could really reap rewards.
I want to talk about Maxwell Lewis, who you have at 25, Pepperdine star, very, very talented offensive player. Some question marks about what he can do defensively. Some question marks about the fact that Pepperdine was a horrendous basketball team last year, despite having Lewis on the roster, Houston Millette, a lot of other very talented players on that team. We've seen the WCC produce some high-end NBA talent outside of Gonzaga recently. Of course, Jalen Williams, the other Jalen Williams at Santa Clara with the Oklahoma City Thunder, was one of the best rookies in the league last year. Lewis, a guy who got a lot of hype early in the season, kind of faded a little bit. You obviously have him here ahead of Brandin Podziemski, the other non-Zag from the WCC, ahead of Julian Strother, of course, the Zag out of the WCC. What is it about Lewis that makes him an appealing first-round pick, and maybe what are some of those concerns about him as a draft prospect long-term?
Well, the appeal is simple. He's 6'8", and he's really good with the ball in his hands.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as simple as that. Concern is that he has defensive woes in a conference, which the WCC is improving.
Yeah.
But it's hard to say it's similar competition level to what the Big 12, the SEC was.
Of course.
And obviously Andy watches the WCC more than anyone. I watch plenty because I'm in that time zone. Yeah. And I've got a buddy that works for UCF, USF, I should say. And I've watched tons of games between BYU and St. Mary's and all those guys. The concern is that the athletic quality of the depth of the team is not the same as it is for one of these big power conferences.
Sure.
It's not that they can't play with them. It's just they don't have as many players that are as athletic. So the fact that Maxwell Lewis was a defensive deficiency in that conference makes me a little worried for how he'll be in the NBA. Also, will he get to play with the ball in his hands? Because I'm not sure how he'll be without it. That's my other concern. But he's someone that I think has more upside than most players that would be picked around this range. You're a Blazers guy. I would not be surprised in the slightest if the Blazers take him at 23. I actually really like that fit.
Yeah, it's a fit I've seen a handful of times. I believe it's who Locked On Blazers host Mike Richmond, my guy. I think that's who he took in the mock draft as well. And I think that there's a pretty obvious fit for him there. It'd be fun to see him do that, although I am curious how that defense is going to translate. I want to talk about the last two guys you have here at the end of your big board, Kobe Brown and Julian Phillips, pair of forwards there. And then obviously some guys that just missed on your big board. Your board does extend past 30, so I was able to see, Omax Prosper's right there, Jalen Wilson is right there, Julian Strother's right there. What is it about Brown and Phillips that have them just a little bit higher than those guys right now? And with both those players in particular, do you expect them to be first-round picks, or do you think you have them maybe a little higher than consensus?
I'll answer the first bit. So Kobe Brown, I think, is a gem hiding in plain sight, and I might have him too low, honestly. Like there's a chance I edit my podcast and my big board after this podcast and move him up. He's someone that is a 45.5% shooter. Yeah, he's got a big body, and he developed his shot a bit late, so maybe there's concern there. But athletically, he's like a dancing bear with a big body, able to defend. And I think there's a role that's been carved out by David Roddy, by Grant Williams for those type of players. And he's a better pure shooter than either of them. And those guys are playing on NBA teams, good NBA teams at that, right. The 2 seed in the West and the East. So I actually think I'll probably move Kobe Brown up, and I expect him to go in the first round. As for Julian Phillips, this is someone that I think should go in the first round based off traits, but I don't actually think he will. And I could be wrong. Like maybe a team falls in love with what he does. But the rationale for me, at least, is you can't teach athleticism and you can't teach like intelligence for the game. And I felt like he was on a team that was really hard for him to succeed just because they were good. They had aspirations to be really, really good. And they had ball dominant players that were significantly older. He was 18 playing with guys that were 22. Tyreek Key was the small forward that he was competing against. Tyreek Key was 24. Wow. And so Julian Phillips to me is someone who has traits that are really desirable, long, athletic forward. Also, someone that has shot 82% from the free throw line. So despite his 3%, which is low, I think he's got more shooting upside. And there are guys that I think I don't expect him to go in the first round. There are guys I expect to go in the first round. I have in the second round, but I actually like them. I just think that this is a pretty good draft at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a handful of guys that we're seeing more often than not show up in the first round that I kind of agree with you on being maybe a little bit lower on. Colby Jones is one that we've seen in the first round quite a bit. You have him at 41 on your big board. Kind of mentioned, I was taking a peek at what you had on there, and just doesn't do any one thing particularly exceptionally. And I'm curious if that's kind of the general gist there on Jones, and maybe why you have him a little lower than the consensus.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I went on a podcast recently and explained like he's good at a lot of things, but a master of none. And when you're going to be an NBA role player, typically you're going to have to be either really good on defense and shoot the ball well, or you're going to have just one exceptional trait. And I don't think he's got that. One player that I wanted to bring up as someone that likely is in the first round, and maybe even two of them. I think Olivier Maxence-Prosper is almost certainly going to be a first round pick. And what's funny about this is an odd feeling being a draft evaluator. I'm pretty sure I had Olivier Maxence-Prosper higher than just about anyone as college basketball was happening. Yeah. I had him about 35 and now I have him 31 or 32 and no one had any that I looked at, and I could be wrong. But no one had him very high, and now he's got a green room invite, which means he's likely to be picked in the top 20. Yeah. And then the other one that I think is likely to be going in the first round is Brandin Podziemski. And that is someone that I'll admit I slept on for much of the year, and then I saw him at the combine. I was like, oh my, like it's gonna work against older and more athletic players. So he's also got a green room invite. Those guys are just both in my 30 through 35 range. Like I mentioned, this update there's not going to be many changes. I might see a Kobe Brown move up. You might see Olivier Maxence-Prosper move up. But I think for the most part, I feel pretty confident in my rankings of where I have them, even though there's a lot of buzz that these guys are going in the first round. I think that there's players that could be better than them. And it's towards the end of the round, I kind of look for potential. Sure. Because, like if you're picking 28, the likelihood is it's not going to work out. So who do I think has the most potential to work out is the way I look at it.
Well, Leif, thank you so much for your expertise, your insight, for giving us the opportunity to go through that big board there as we await the actual NBA draft taking place 8 p.m. Eastern time today on Thursday, June 22nd. So definitely check that out. We'll have a live show going on throughout the draft. It's going to be extremely fun. The best place to be for all of the insight into the NBA draft. Leif, thank you so much again. Appreciate you coming on, and good luck with the rest of draft day.
Thank you. Anytime.